The grandmother abandoned by her son found refuge in an old wooden barn, but what she found in the hay changed her life. Margaret clutched her worn cardigan tighter around her shoulders as the cold November wind whipped through the empty parking lot. She stood there, watching the taillights of her son's car disappear into the darkness, the red glow fading like the last warmth in her heart. 73 years old, and she'd been left at a gas station like an unwanted piece of luggage. "Mom, I can't do this anymore," David had said just 20 minutes earlier, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Sarah says it's either you or her. The kids need their own rooms. We can't afford to take care of you anymore." Margaret hadn't argued. What could she say? That she'd raise him alone after his father died? That she'd worked 2 jobs to put him through college? That she'd babysat those same grandchildren every weekend for 5 years? None of it seemed to matter now. She'd seen the exhaustion in her daughter-in-law's eyes, heard the arguments through the thin walls of their suburban home. She'd become a burden, plain and simple. The gas station attendant had already eyed her suspiciously twice. She couldn't stay here. With shaking hands, she counted the crumpled bills in her purse. $47 and some change. Everything she had in the world. David had promised to send money, but Margaret knew better than to count on promises anymore. She started walking. The small town of Millbrook wasn't her home. She'd never been here before, but it was where David had decided to leave her. The main street was mostly dark, just a few streetlights casting pools of yellow on the cracked sidewalk. A diner glowed warmly in the distance, but Margaret kept walking. $47 wouldn't last long if she spent it on coffee and sympathy. Her feet ached in her old sneakers. She'd been wearing them for 3 years now, the soles worn thin as paper. Each step sent a jolt of pain through her knees, her hips, her lower back. Getting old was nobody's friend, but getting old and homeless was a special kind of hell. "You all right there, ma'am?" A voice startled her. A young police officer sat in his patrol car, window rolled down, concern written across his baby face. "Just fine, officer. Just taking an evening walk." Margaret forced a smile. The same smile she'd given the neighbors when David's father's drinking got bad. The same smile she'd worn to parent-teacher conferences when she couldn't afford new clothes. The officer looked like he wanted to say more, but Margaret kept walking. She couldn't afford to be picked up, couldn't afford to be put in some system. She'd heard stories about what happened to old folks with nowhere to go. State homes where they parked you in front of a TV until you forgot your own name. At the edge of town, the streetlights ended. The road stretched ahead into darkness, lined with bare trees that rattled their branches like skeleton fingers. Margaret's breath came in short gasps now, each one visible in the freezing air. She should have grabbed her heavy coat, but David had been in such a hurry to get rid of her, and she'd been too shocked to think straight. A stitch formed in her side. She pressed her hand against it and kept going. What choice did she have? Stop and freeze to death on the roadside? At least if she kept moving, she had a chance. The moon emerged from behind the clouds, bright and cold and indifferent. By its light, Margaret spotted something off to the left, a structure set back from the road. She squinted, her cataracts making everything slightly blurry. It looked like an old barn, the kind you saw in paintings of rural America that didn't exist anymore. Margaret left the road, her feet crunching through dry grass and fallen leaves. The barn loomed larger as she approached, its wooden walls weathered to a silver gray, its roof sagging in the middle like a tired old horse. One of the doors hung crooked on its hinges. She paused at the entrance, listening. Nothing but the wind and the distant hoot of an owl. Using both hands, she pulled the door open wider. The hinges screamed in protest, a sound that seemed loud enough to wake the dead. Margaret froze, waiting to see if anyone would come investigate. Nobody did. Inside, the barn smelled of old hay and motor oil and years of weather seeping through the walls. Margaret's eyes slowly adjusted to the deeper darkness. She could make out the shape of what might have been a tractor once, now just a rusted skeleton. Piles of hay bales were stacked along one wall, and overhead, the loft was thick with shadows. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. Margaret felt her way toward the hay bales, her hands outstretched like a child playing blind man's bluff. The hay was dry, at least, And when she sat down on one of the bales, it gave a little, almost comfortable. She pulled her cardigan tighter and lay down, using her purse as a pillow. The hay poked through her clothes, scratchy and uncomfortable, but it was better than the frozen ground outside. Above her, through gaps in the roof, she could see stars. More stars than she'd seen in years, living in the city. They looked cold and distant and beautiful. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She'd cried earlier, when David first told her to get out, but she'd held it together at the gas station. Now, alone in this abandoned barn with nothing but $47 and the clothes on her back, she let herself sob. Great, heaving sobs that shook her thin frame and echoed in the empty space. She cried for the life she'd lost, for the son who'd thrown her away, for the grandchildren she'd never see grow up. She cried for the girl she'd been once, full of dreams and hope, and for the old woman she'd become, unwanted and alone. Eventually, the tears stopped. Margaret lay there, exhausted, staring at the stars through the broken roof. Maybe this was how it ended. Maybe they'd find her here in a few days, frozen solid. Just another sad story for people to tisk over before getting back to their own lives. But she wasn't dead yet, and Margaret had survived too much to give up now. She'd survived her husband's death, survived raising a child alone, survived cancer 10 years ago when the doctors weren't sure she'd make it. She'd survived, and maybe that's what she did best. Her eyes grew heavy. The adrenaline that kept her going was wearing off, leaving her hollowed out and bone-tired. Despite the cold, despite the scratchy hay, despite everything, Margaret felt herself drifting towards sleep. Just before she went under, she heard something, a small sound, coming from deeper in the hay pile beside her, a rustling like something moving. Margaret's eyes snapped open, her heart suddenly pounding. Rats? Raccoons? Something worse? She held perfectly still, listening. There was again a soft sound, almost like breathing, but not animal breathing. Something else. Margaret sat up slowly, every instinct telling her to be careful. She reached into her purse and pulled out the small flashlight she always carried, a cheap plastic thing she bought at a dollar store years ago. She clicked it on. The weak beam barely penetrated the darkness, but it was enough. She aimed the light at the hay pile beside her. At first, she saw nothing unusual, just hay and more hay. But then she saw it, a patch of different color, something blue and synthetic among all that yellow-brown natural fiber. With trembling hands, Margaret began pulling away the hay. More blue appeared, fabric of some kind. She pulled away more hay, working faster now, her heart hammering in her chest. And then she saw it. A face. A small face, dirty and tear-stained, eyes squeezed shut. A child. A little girl, maybe 4 or 5 years old, curled up in the hay like a kitten, wearing nothing but a thin dress and no shoes, shivering even in her sleep. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to keep receiving more emotional stories like this one. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss our touching tales. Margaret's hands flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. The child was real, not some hallucination brought on by exhaustion and cold. She was tiny and possibly thin, with matted brown hair and skin so pale it was almost translucent in the flashlight beam. Her little chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, and even unconscious, she whimpered softly, a sound that broke Margaret's heart into 1,000 pieces. "Oh, sweetheart," Margaret whispered, her own problems forgotten in an instant. She touched the child's forehead gently. The girl was ice cold, her lips tinged blue at the edges. Hypothermia. Margaret had seen it before, years ago, when a neighbor's kid had gotten lost in a snowstorm. Without thinking, Margaret pulled off her cardigan and wrapped it around the child. It wasn't much, but it was something. She gathered the tiny body into her arms, and the girl barely stirred, which scared Margaret more than anything. A healthy child would wake up when grabbed by a stranger. This one didn't even flutter her eyelids. Margaret looked around frantically. She needed to warm this child up, and fast. Her nursing training from 50 years ago came flooding back. The things you never really forgot. Keep the victim warm. Get their core temperature up. Check for frostbite on the extremities. She pulled more hay around them both, creating a kind of nest. Then she held the child close to her own body, sharing what little warmth she had. The girl was so light, couldn't have weighed more than 30 pounds. Margaret could feel her ribs through the thin dress, could see the hollow of her cheeks. This child hadn't just been abandoned recently. She'd been neglected for a long time. "Come on, baby," Margaret murmured, rubbing the child's arms and legs gently, trying to get the circulation going. "Stay with me. Don't you dare give up." The child's eyelids fluttered. Then, slowly, painfully, they opened. Brown eyes stare up at Margaret, unfocused at first, then sharpening with fear. "Sure, it's okay," Margaret said softly. "I'm not going to hurt you. My name is Margaret." "What's your name, sweetheart?" The child's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She tried again, and this time a whisper emerged, so faint Margaret had to lean in to hear it. "Lucy." "Lucy," Margaret repeated, smiling through her tears. "That's a beautiful name. Lucy, are you hurt? Does anything hurt badly?" Lucy shook her head slightly, then immediately contradicted herself by wincing. Margaret gently felt along the child's limbs, checking for breaks or sprains. Everything seemed intact, which was a miracle, but Lucy's feet were in bad shape, covered in cuts and bruises, the toes red and swollen. "Lucy, honey, where are your parents? Where's your mama?" The child's eyes filled with tears, and she started to shake. Not from the cold this time, but from fear or trauma or both. Margaret held her closer, making soothing sounds like she used to make when David was little and had nightmares. "It's okay. You don't have to tell me right now. Let's just get you warm, all right?" But Lucy grabbed Margaret's arm with surprising strength. "Mama's gone," she whispered. "Mama left me here. Said she'd come back. But she didn't come back." Margaret's blood ran cold. "When did she leave you, sweetheart? When did your mama leave?" Lucy's face scrunched up, thinking. "After the sun went down. 2 times the sun went down. 2 days. This child had been abandoned in this barn for 2 days, with no food, no water, no warmth. What kind of monster would do that to their own child?" But even as Margaret thought it, she remembered David's car driving away from the gas station, remembered the way he couldn't even look at her in the rear-view mirror. People did terrible things when they were desperate. People abandoned the ones they were supposed to love. Margaret knew that better than anyone now. "Well, your mama isn't here, but I am," Margaret said firmly, "and I'm going to take care of you. First things first, are you hungry?" Lucy nodded, her eyes going wide. Margaret reached for her purse and pulled out the only food she had, a granola bar she'd taken from David's kitchen that morning, back when she still lived there, back in what felt like another lifetime. She unwrapped it and broke off a small piece, not wanting Lucy to eat too fast and get sick. The child grabbed it and shoved it in her mouth, barely chewing before swallowing. She reached for more, and Margaret had to gently stop her. "Slowly, baby. I know you're hungry, but you got to eat slowly or it'll make you sick." Lucy nodded, but tears streamed down her face as she chewed the next piece more slowly. Margaret recognized that look, the desperation of someone who didn't know where their next meal was coming from. She'd worn that look herself during the hardest years after her husband died. They sat there in the hay, the old woman and the abandoned child, sharing a granola bar in the darkness. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the gaps in the barn walls. Margaret pulled more hay around them, building up their little nest until they were almost buried in it. "Margaret." Lucy's voice was small and scared. "Are you going to leave me too?" The question hit Margaret like a physical blow. She looked down at this tiny girl, this child who'd been thrown away just like she had, and something inside her shifted. All the pain and betrayal and despair she'd been carrying transformed into something else. Something hard and determined and fierce. "No," Margaret said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. "No, Lucy, I'm not going to leave you. I promise. We're going to stick together, you and me." "Okay." Lucy nodded and burrowed closer, her small body fitting perfectly against Margaret's chest. Within minutes, she was asleep again, exhausted from her ordeal. But this time, her breathing was steadier, her color slightly better. Margaret held her and stared into the darkness, her mind racing. She had $47, no home, no job, no prospects. She was 73 years old with arthritis and cataracts and high blood pressure she couldn't afford medication for. She was, by any reasonable measure, the worst possible person to take care of an abandoned child. But she was also the only person. And sometimes that was enough. The night stretched on, cold and long. Margaret dozed fitfully, waking every few minutes to check that Lucy was still breathing, still warm. Each time, she felt a surge of relief when she saw the small chest rising and falling. As the first gray light of dawn began filtering through the gaps in the barn walls, Margaret made a decision. She couldn't go to the authorities. They'd take Lucy, put her in the system, and Margaret would never see her again. They'd probably put Margaret in a home, too. Separate them. Let this child down one more time. No, Margaret had been backed into a corner too many times in her life to let it happen again. She'd figured this out. She'd survived everything life had thrown at her so far. She could survive this, too. Lucy stirred in her arms, her eyes opening slowly. Margaret, I'm here, sweetheart. I'm right here. I'm thirsty. Margaret's heart sank. She had no water, but she had to find some, and soon. She gently laid Lucy back in a hay nest, making sure she was covered with the cardigan. I'm going to look around the barn, see if there's any water. I'll be right back. I promise. Can you be brave for just a few minutes? Lucy nodded, but her eyes filled with fear. Margaret hated leaving her, even for a moment, but she had no choice. She stood up, her joints protesting after a night on the cold ground. Everything hurt, her back, her knees, her hips, but she gritted her teeth and started searching the barn. Near the rusted tractor, she found a workbench covered in old tools and debris. And there, miracle of miracles, was a plastic water bottle, about a quarter full. Margaret grabbed it and examined it closely. The water looked clear, and when she smelled it, it didn't seem contaminated. It was probably rainwater that had collected somehow. Not ideal, but better than nothing. She brought it back to Lucy, who drank greedily. Margaret had to pull the bottle away before she could drink too much. Easy, baby. Not too fast. As Lucy drank, Margaret's mind kept working on the problem. Food, water, shelter, those were the immediate needs. She looked around the barn with new eyes, not as a place to die, but as a potential home. It wasn't much, but it was something. The walls were solid enough, the roof mostly intact. There was hay for bedding, and that tractor might have tools they could use. If she could find a way to heat the place, block up some of the gaps in the walls, they might be able to survive here for a while. Make sure you're subscribed to our channel. We share heartwarming stories like this one every week. Click that subscribe button and join our community of story lovers. Margaret spent the morning exploring every corner of the old barn while Lucy watched from the safety of the hay nest. The structure was bigger than she'd first realized, with a loft overhead and several smaller rooms that might have been used for storing grain or equipment. In one of these rooms, Margaret found something that made her heart leap. An old wood stove, rusty but still intact. "Lucy, stay there just a minute longer," Margaret called out, examining the stove more closely. The pipe was still attached, leading up through the roof. If she could get this thing working, they'd have heat. That would change everything. She searched the barn for anything burnable and found a decent pile of old wooden boards, pieces of broken fence, and even some coal in a dusty bin. Someone had left all this behind when they abandoned the property, and now it might save their lives. Margaret's hands were shaking as she arranged some of the smaller pieces of wood in the stove. She still had the lighter David used for his cigarettes. She'd found in the car and kept it, thinking she might need it. She'd been more right than she knew. The first match didn't take. Neither did the second. Margaret said a prayer, something she hadn't done in years, and tried again. This time, the wood caught a tiny flame that grew into a small fire. She carefully added more wood, and soon the stove was putting out real heat. "Lucy, come here, honey." Slowly now. The little girl climbed out of the hay nest and walked over on unsteady legs. When she felt the warmth from the stove, her whole face lit up. It was the first time Margaret had seen her smile, and it was beautiful. They stood there together, warming themselves, and Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. Maybe they could do this. Maybe they could actually survive. But survival meant more than just heat. They needed food, and Margaret's $47 wouldn't last long. She thought about the small town they'd passed through last night. There had to be a grocery store, maybe a church, someplace where she could stretch her money as far as possible. Lucy, I need to go into town and get us some supplies. Food and water, and some things to make this place more comfortable. Can you stay here while I'm gone? Lucy's face crumpled. Don't leave me. I have to, sweetheart, just for a little while. We need food. I'll come with you. Margaret looked at the child's torn dress, her bare feet, her matted hair. They couldn't walk into town like this. People would ask questions, call the police, and their fragile new beginning would end before it started. Not yet, Margaret said gently. But I promise I'll be as quick as I can. You stay here by the stove, stay warm, and I'll be back before you know it. I promise, Lucy. And I keep my promises. Lucy looked at her for a long moment, those brown eyes searching Margaret's face for any sign of deception. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she nodded slowly. Margaret left the barn with a heavy heart, looking back 3 times to see Lucy's small face watching her from the doorway. Each time she waved, and each time Lucy waved back. The walk into town was longer than Margaret remembered from last night. Her feet hurt worse than before, and her stomach was growling. She'd given Lucy most of the granola bar, keeping only a small piece for herself. But she didn't regret it. The look of relief on that child's face had been worth any amount of hunger. Millbrook in the daytime was a typical small American town, a main street with a few shops, a post office, a diner, and a general store that looked like it had been there since the Depression. Margaret headed for the general store, mentally calculating what she could buy with $47. The bell above the door jingled as she entered. The store smelled like coffee and old wood, and a portly man behind the counter looked up from his newspaper. "Help you, ma'am?" "Just browsing, thank you," Margaret said, forcing a pleasant tone. She couldn't let anyone see how desperate she was. She grabbed a basket and started walking the aisles, choosing carefully. Bread, peanut butter, crackers, cheap cookies, powdered milk, instant oatmeal, canned soup, bottled water. Things that didn't need refrigeration. Things that would fill a small stomach. She added a bar of soap and the cheapest bottle of shampoo she could find. Lucy needed a bath badly. At the clothing section, her heart sank. Everything was too expensive. But then she spotted a clearance bin, end-of-season stuff they were trying to get rid of. She dug through it and found a child's sweatshirt. Too big, but Lucy could grow into it, and a pair of thick socks. Not shoes. Those were all too expensive, but the socks would help. Margaret brought everything to the counter and watched nervously as the clerk rang it up. "That'll be $42.50, he said. Margaret counted out her bills, her hands trembling slightly. She had $4.50 left. $4.50 to last until she could figure out something else. "You new in town?" the clerk asked as he bagged her groceries. "Just passing through," Margaret lied. "Visiting family." The clerk nodded, not really interested, and Margaret grabbed her bags and hurried out before he could ask any more questions. On the way back to the barn, she spotted something that made her pause. A church with a sign out front advertising community meal on Sundays. Free food. Margaret made a mental note of the address. That could help stretch their resources. She also noticed a help wanted sign in the window of the diner. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. She'd waitressed years ago, back before David was born. Maybe they'd hire someone her age? It was worth a try, though not today. Today, she needed to get back to Lucy. The little girl was exactly where Margaret had left her, sitting by the now dying fire, looking terrified. When she saw Margaret, she burst into tears and ran to her, wrapping her thin arms around Margaret's waist. "I thought you weren't coming back." "I told you I'd come back, didn't I?" Margaret set down the bags and stroked Lucy's matted hair. "I keep my promises, remember?" She showed Lucy everything she bought, and the child's eyes went wide at the sight of so much food. Margaret opened the peanut butter and made them each a sandwich, using her finger to spread it since she hadn't thought to buy a knife. They ate slowly, savoring every bite, and Margaret gave Lucy one of the cookies for dessert. "Best cookie I ever had," Lucy said seriously, and Margaret had to blink back tears. After they ate, Margaret heated some water in an old bucket she'd found, using the wood stove. She stripped Lucy down, trying not to react to all the bruises and marks on the child's body, some old and yellowed, some newer and purple. Someone had hurt this little girl, hurt her badly and often. "Who did this to you, Lucy?" Margaret asked gently as she washed the child's back. Lucy was quiet for a long moment. "Mama's boyfriend. He was mean. He hit me when I was bad. Mama said I was too much, that she couldn't keep me no more. That's why she brought me here." Margaret's hands clenched into fists, and she had to take a deep breath to calm herself. What kind of mother would let a man beat her child? What kind of mother would abandon a little girl in a freezing barn to die? But then she thought of David, abandoning his own mother at a gas station. People did terrible things. People failed the ones they were supposed to protect. She knew that better than anyone now. "Well, that man isn't here," Margaret said firmly, working the cheap shampoo through Lucy's tangled hair. "And your mama isn't here either. But I am. And nobody is ever going to hurt you again. Do you understand me, Lucy? Nobody." Lucy turned and looked at her, water dripping from her hair. "Promise?" "I promise." After the bath, Lucy looked like a different child. Her hair, once clean and brushed out, was actually quite pretty, light brown with hints of gold. Her skin was pale, but no longer gray. Margaret dressed her in the new sweatshirt and socks, and Lucy beamed like she'd been given a ball gown. They spent the rest of the day making the barn more livable. Margaret found some old canvas tarps and used them to block the worst of the gaps in the walls. She created a proper sleeping area with the hay bales arranged to block the wind, and she kept the fire going in the wood stove. As night fell again, they sat together by the fire, eating crackers with peanut butter and sharing one of the bottles of water. Lucy leaned against Margaret's side, and for the first time since David had abandoned her, Margaret felt something close to peace. "Margaret?" Lucy asked, her voice drowsy with warmth and a full stomach. "Yes, sweetheart." "Are you my grandma now?" Margaret's throat tightened. She thought of David, of the grandchildren she'd never see again, of the family she'd lost. And she looked at this little girl, this abandoned child who needed someone, anyone, to love her. "Yes," Margaret said, pulling Lucy close. "Yes, I guess I am." Lucy smiled and closed her eyes, and within minutes she was asleep. Margaret held her and stared into the fire, thinking about tomorrow and the day after that and all the days to come. She had no plan, no prospects, no idea how they'd survive. But they would survive. Margaret was certain of that now. She'd been given a second chance, a reason to keep fighting. She wouldn't waste it. Outside, the November wind howled. But inside the barn, by the light of the wood stove, an old woman and a young child slept peacefully, two lost souls who'd found each other in the darkness. Don't miss out on more incredible stories. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can follow Margaret and Lucy's journey. We post new emotional stories regularly. The days that followed fell into a routine that was equal parts desperate and oddly comforting. Margaret would wake with the dawn, her body aching from sleeping on the hay, but the weight of Lucy nestled against her side made every pain worthwhile. The little girl had started calling her grandma without any prompting, and the word made Margaret's heart swell every time she heard it. Their first priority each morning was a fire. Margaret had become skilled at rationing their wood supply, knowing that when winter truly set in, they'd need every scrap they could find. Lucy helped by gathering kindling from around the property, small sticks and dried leaves that caught easily and got the fire going. On the third day, Margaret made the walk back into town and applied for the waitressing job at the diner. The owner, a gruff man named Frank with a handlebar mustache, looked skeptical when she walked in. "How old are you?" he asked bluntly. "Old enough to know how to work hard and show up on time," Margaret replied. "I waitressed for 15 years back in Chicago. I know how to handle a rush, how to keep customers happy, and how to balance 3 plates on one arm." Frank studied her for a long moment. "I can only pay minimum wage. 4 days a week, 6-hour shifts. Tips are yours to keep, but they're not great in a town this small." "I'll take it," Margaret said without hesitation. She started the next day, leaving Lucy alone in the barn with strict instructions to stay hidden and keep the fire going. It broke Margaret's heart to leave her, but they needed the money desperately. Their food was already running low, and winter clothes would cost more than she had. The work was harder than Margaret remembered. Her feet screamed in protest after 6 hours of standing, and her back felt like someone had driven a railroad spike through it. But she smiled at every customer, refilled every coffee cup, and cleared every table as fast as her old body would allow. The tips were meager, just as Frank had warned, but every dollar counted. And at the end of each shift, Frank let her take home whatever food would have been thrown out: day-old muffins, soup that hadn't sold, the occasional sandwich someone had ordered and then canceled. Margaret packaged it all carefully and brought it back to Lucy, who treated each meal like a feast. "You're too skinny, Grandma," Lucy said one evening, watching Margaret pick at a piece of bread while giving the child most of their dinner. "You need to eat, too." "I'm fine, sweetheart. Growing girls need food more than old ladies." But she wasn't fine. Margaret could feel herself getting weaker, the weight dropping off her already thin frame. She was burning more calories than she was taking in, and her body was paying the price. Several times at work, she'd felt dizzy, had to grab the counter to keep from falling. Frank had noticed but hadn't said anything yet. On Sunday, they ventured out together for the first time, walking to the church for the community meal. Margaret had scrubbed Lucy as clean as possible and dressed her in the sweatshirt and her least torn dress. She'd done her best with the child's hair, braiding it to hide how badly it needed a proper cut. The church basement was warm and filled with the smell of home-cooked food. Long tables were set up, and a handful of volunteers served plates of roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and rolls. Margaret's mouth watered at the sight of so much food. "Welcome." A woman with kind eyes and gray hair approached them. "I'm Pastor Ruth. Are you new to our community?" "Just passing through," Margaret lied smoothly. She'd gotten good at lying lately. "I'm Margaret, and this is my granddaughter, Lucy." Pastor Ruth smiled at Lucy, who was behind Margaret's legs. "Well, you're very welcome here. Please, sit anywhere you like." They filled their plates and found a spot at the end of one of the tables. Lucy ate slowly at first, still not quite believing that all this food was really for her. But as she realized nobody was going to take it away, she started eating faster, her cheeks bulging with mashed potatoes. "Slow down, honey," Margaret whispered. "Nobody's going to take it." An elderly man sat down across from them, his plate piled even higher than Lucy's. "Good to see young people at these things," he said, nodding at Lucy. "Usually just us old folks." "My granddaughter has a healthy appetite," Margaret said, smiling. They talked while they ate, surface conversation about the weather in the town, and nothing important. But Margaret learned that these community meals happened every Sunday, and there was also a food pantry that was open on Wednesdays. She filed that information away, already planning to visit on her next day off. As they were leaving, Pastor Ruth touched Margaret's arm gently. "Margaret, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but if you and Lucy need any help, any kind of assistance, the church has resources. We have a fund for people going through hard times." Margaret's pride flared up, ready to refuse, but she thought of Lucy shivering in the barn, of their dwindling supplies, of the long winter ahead. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I'll keep that in mind." Walking back to the barn, Lucy held Margaret's hand and chatted happily about the food, about the nice people, about how much she liked the cookies they'd given her on the way out. Margaret listened and smiled and tried not to think about how precarious their situation really was. At night, after Lucy was asleep, Margaret would lie awake and calculate their resources. She was making about $30 a day at the diner between wages and tips, which meant roughly $120 a week. It wasn't nearly enough. The barn wouldn't stay warm once real winter hit. They needed warmer clothes, more blankets, more food. Lucy needed shoes desperately. Her little feet were getting torn up despite the socks. And then there was a bigger question Margaret tried not to think about. What was she going to do about school? Lucy should be in kindergarten or first grade. She should be learning to read and write and do math. Instead, she was living in a bar with a woman, who had no legal right to care for her. But the alternative, calling child services, turning Lucy over to the system, was unthinkable. Margaret had heard too many horror stories about foster care, about children lost in the system, abused, neglected, shuttled from home to home. Lucy had already been through so much. Margaret couldn't bear to put her through more, so she'd teach Lucy herself. She remembered enough from raising David. She could teach her letters and numbers, how to read, how to do basic math. They could check out books from the library. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. 2 weeks into their new life, Margaret got a scare that nearly stopped her heart. She was at work, refilling coffee for a table of regulars, when she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Mom? Mom, is that you?" Margaret turned slowly. David stood in the doorway of the diner, his face a mixture of shock and something that might have been guilt. Sarah stood beside him, her arms crossed, her expression hard. "David." Margaret's hand shook, coffee sloshing in the pot she was holding. "What are you doing here?" "We were driving through, heading to Sarah's mother's place for Thanksgiving." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Mom, what are you doing here?" "Working in a diner." "Making a living," Margaret said coolly. "What does it look like?" Sarah snorted. "Frank, isn't it? We'll take that corner booth." Frank nodded from behind the counter, and Margaret had no choice but to follow them to seat them. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst out of her chest. She couldn't let David know about Lucy. He might try to call social services, might try to help in a way that would tear apart the fragile life she and Lucy had built. "Mom, where are you staying?" David asked once they were seated. He had the decency to look uncomfortable, at least. "I'm managing just fine," Margaret said, pulling out her order pad with trembling hands. "What can I get you?" "Mom, please. I've been worried sick. I tried calling the shelters, the hospitals." "You worried?" Margaret's voice came out sharper than she intended, and several heads turned. She lowered her voice. "You left me at a gas station, David, with $47. You worried about that." David flinched. Sarah rolled her eyes and studied the menu. "I'll have the turkey sandwich," Sarah said, as if Margaret hadn't spoken. "And a Diet Coke." "Coffee. Black," David said quietly. "And Mom, we need to talk. After your shift." "There's nothing to talk about," Margaret said. She wrote down their orders and walked away, her legs shaking so badly she had to grab the counter for support. Frank appeared at her elbow. "You okay, Maggie?" She'd asked him to call her Maggie instead of Margaret, a small protection in case anyone came looking for her. "I'm fine. Just some people I used to know." Frank studied her face, then looked over at David and Sarah. "Want me to handle that table?" "No," Margaret said firmly. "I've got it." She delivered their food mechanically, avoiding eye contact, saying as little as possible. David tried several times to start a conversation, but Margaret shut him down each time. She could feel his eyes on her as she worked, could feel the weight of his judgment. His mother, reduced to waiting tables in a dying town. It probably embarrassed him. When they finally left, David put a $100 bill under his plate. Margaret stared at it, a hurricane of emotions swirling through her. Pride told her to tear it up, to throw it after him. But practicality won out. That $100 meant food for Lucy, warm clothes, maybe even a blanket that didn't smell like motor oil. She pocketed the money and finished her shift. When she got back to the barn that evening, Lucy was waiting by the door, bouncing with excitement. "Grandma! Grandma, look what I found." She held out her hand, and it was a small carved wooden bird, smooth with age, its wings spread as if in flight. "Where did you find that, sweetheart?" "Up in the loft. There's boxes up there, Grandma." Lots of boxes with old stuff in them. Margaret felt a chill. She'd told Lucy specifically not to go up to the loft. It wasn't safe. The boards were rotten in places. But she couldn't be angry, not when the child's face was so bright with joy. "Let's go look together," Margaret said. "But you stay right beside me, understand? Some of those boards aren't safe." They climbed the rickety ladder to the loft carefully, Margaret going first to test each board. Lucy was right. There were boxes up here, old cardboard boxes, and wooden crates covered in dust and cobwebs. Margaret opened the nearest box and found it full of clothes, old-fashioned dresses, and shirts from what looked like the 1950s or 60s. Another box held books, their pages yellowed and brittle. A third contained dishes wrapped in newspaper. "Someone lived here," Margaret said softly, pulling out a photograph from one of the boxes. It showed a young family, a mother and father and 3 children, standing in front of this very barn when it was new and painted white. This must have been their farm. "Where did they go?" Lucy asked. "I don't know, honey, but they left a lot behind." Margaret's mind was already working. These clothes could be altered, cut down for Lucy. The books could teach them both new things. The dishes meant they wouldn't have to eat out of their hands anymore. This wasn't just an abandoned barn. It was a treasure trove. They spent the evening going through the boxes by lamplight. Margaret found blankets, quilts that smelled musty but were still intact. She found tools, a proper knife, like an opener, things that would make their life so much easier. She found children's books, simple readers that would be perfect for teaching Lucy. And at the bottom of one box, wrapped in cloth, she found money. Not a lot, maybe $200 in old bills, but it felt like $1 million to Margaret. Someone had hidden this here, probably a family in the photograph, and then never came back for it. Is it wrong to keep it? Lucy asked, watching Margaret count the bills with shaking hands. Margaret thought about it. Someone had left this money here, probably decades ago. The family was likely long gone. The children in the photo probably grandparents themselves now, if they were still alive. This money had been sitting here useless for years, maybe 50 years or more. No, Margaret decided. I think whoever left this will want someone to use it, especially someone who needs it as badly as we do. That night, they slept under real quilts for the first time, warm and comfortable. Lucy cuddled close to Margaret, the wooden bird clutched in her hand. "Grandma," she whispered in the darkness. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm happy here, with you. I know it's not a real house, but it feels like home." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "It feels like home to me too, Lucy." And it did. This drafty barn with its hay bales and wood stove had become more of a home than David's house ever was. Because home wasn't about walls or roofs or comfortable furniture. Home was about love, about being wanted, about matching to someone. Margaret and Lucy had both been thrown away, deemed worthless by the people who were supposed to love them. But they'd found each other, and in finding each other, they found something precious, a reason to keep going. The winter deepened, and their life in the barn continued. Margaret worked her shifts at the diner, carefully saving every dollar. She visited the food pantry on Wednesdays, swallowing her pride and accepting the boxes of canned goods and pasta. She and Lucy went to the Sunday community meals at the church, and slowly, people stopped asking questions about where they were staying. Margaret altered some of the old clothes from the loft to fit Lucy, and the child wore them proudly, even though they were decades out of style. She taught Lucy her letters using the children's books they'd found, and the little girl was a quick learner, hungry for knowledge. On Christmas Eve, Pastor Ruth showed up at the diner with a wrapped present. "For Lucy," she said simply, "every child deserves a gift at Christmas." Margaret opened it later, back at the barn. Inside was a beautiful winter coat, warm and lined with fleece, in just about Lucy's size. There was also a pair of sturdy boots and a note that said simply, "From a friend." Lucy's face lit up when she saw the coat and boots. She put them on immediately and refused to take them off, even when she went to bed. How did Pastor Ruth know we needed this? Lucy asked. Margaret didn't have an answer. Maybe the pastor had guessed. Maybe she'd noticed Lucy's torn shoes and thin clothes. Or maybe, Margaret thought, maybe there were still good people in the world, people who help without expecting anything in return. Keep following Margaret and Lucy's journey. Subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories of survival, hope, and love. Hit that subscribe button now. Winter hit hard in January, bringing with it snow and ice and temperatures that made the barn feel like a freezer despite the wood stove burning constantly. Margaret had to make multiple trips each day to keep enough wood stockpiled, and her body protested every movement. Her joints ached in the cold, and more than once she found herself struggling to breathe, her old lungs not handling the freezing air well. But she kept going. She had to. Lucy depended on her. The child was thriving despite their circumstances. She gained weight, her cheeks filling out and taking on a healthy color. She was learning to read, sounding out words in the old children's books with fierce concentration. She laughed more now, played with a wooden bird, and other toys Margaret had fashioned from things in the barn. She was becoming the child she should have been all along. One evening in late January, Margaret came home from work to find Lucy standing in the barn doorway, looking worried. "Grandma, there was a man here today. He was walking around the barn, looking at everything." Margaret's blood ran cold. "What did he look like?" "Old, like you. Gray hair. He had a camera and was taking pictures." Property owner, Margaret thought immediately. Someone had finally noticed people were living in the abandoned barn. This was it, the end of their little sanctuary. "Did he see you?" Lucy shook her head. "I hid in the hay like you taught me." "But Grandma, what if he comes back? What if he makes us leave?" "We'll figure it out," Margaret said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "We always do." But that night, she lay awake long after Lucy fell asleep, staring at the ceiling and trying to plan. Where would they go if they were evicted? The few dollars she'd save wouldn't be enough for even a week in a motel. They could try another abandoned building, but winter was the worst time to be looking for shelter. The next morning, a truck pulled up outside the barn. Margaret positioned herself between Lucy and the door, ready to protect the child no matter what. An elderly man climbed out, the same one Lucy had described. He approached slowly, his hands visible and empty. "Hello," he called out. "I'm not here to make trouble. My name is Robert Morrison. This is my family's barn, or was." Margaret stepped outside, leaving Lucy hidden inside. "I'm sorry for trespassing, Mr. Morrison. We'll leave right away." Robert shook his head. "That's not why I'm here. When I saw signs that someone was living here, saw the smoke from the chimney, I was curious. This place has been empty for 30 years, since my parents died. I drove out yesterday to take a look." "We haven't damaged anything," Margaret said quickly. "We've been very careful." "I know," Robert interrupted gently. "I could see that. I could also see that whoever's living here has been taking good care of the place, better than it's been cared for in decades." He paused, studying Margaret's face. "I also saw the child's drawings in the dirt outside, and the small footprints in the hay." Margaret's heart sank. She'd been so careful, but not careful enough. "Please," she said, and she hated how her voice cracked. "Don't call the authorities. She's my granddaughter, and I'm taking good care of her. We just need a little more time to get on our feet." "I'm not going to call anyone," Robert said. He pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket. "I'm going to do something else instead." Margaret took the envelope with shaking hands. Inside were keys and a deed. "This barn and the 5 acres it sits on are now yours," Robert said. "Consider an early inheritance that I'm giving to someone who will actually use it." Margaret stared at the papers, unable to process what she was seeing. "I don't understand. Why would you?" "Because 30 years ago, my wife and I lived in this barn when we first got married. We were poor as church mice, just like you, and if someone had offered us a chance, offered us a real start, it would have changed everything." His eyes grew distant. "We made it eventually, built ourselves up, but it was hard. Harder than it needed to be. I've got more money than I know what to do with now, and no kids to leave it to. Seems like fate, you living here." "I can't accept this," Margaret said, even though every fiber of her being was screaming at her to take it. "Why not?" "Because it's too much. Because I haven't earned it. Because you think you don't deserve help?" Robert smiled sadly. "I've been watching this town for a while now, seeing how you work at Frank's Diner, seeing you and your granddaughter at the church meals. You're working yourself to death to take care of that child. That tells me everything I need to know about what kind of person you are." Lucy appeared in the doorway, unable to stay hidden any longer. "Grandma? What's happening?" Robert's face softened when he saw her. "Hello there. You must be Lucy." Lucy nodded shyly, moving closer to Margaret. Lucy, I'm giving your grandma this barn. It's yours now, yours and hers. Nobody can make you leave ever again. Lucy's eyes went wide. Really? This is our home? For real? For real, Robert confirmed. The child burst into tears and ran to hug Margaret. We have a home, Grandma. We really have a home. Margaret couldn't speak. She just held Lucy and cried, all the fear and stress and exhaustion of the past months pouring out of her. Robert tactfully walked back to his truck and pretended to check something in the bed, giving them privacy. When Margaret finally collected herself, she approached him with Lucy still clutching her hand. "Thank you," she said, and the words felt inadequate for the magnitude of what he'd done. "I don't know how to repay you." "You don't repay it," Robert said firmly. "You accept it. You build a life here. And someday, when you have more than you need, you help someone else who's struggling. That's how it works." He handed her another envelope, thicker this time. "There's some money in there to help with repairs and improvements. The roof needs work, and you'll want to insulate better before next winter. There's a well on the property that should still work, and I'll have the power turned on by the end of the week." "Mr. Morrison, I can't." "Yes, you can. And you will." He smiled at Lucy. "Take care of your grandma, sweetheart. She's a fighter." "I will," Lucy promised solemnly. Robert got in his truck and started the engine. But before he drove away, he rolled down the window. "Margaret, that's your name, right?" "Yes." "One more thing. There are people in this town who'll help you, if you let them. Pastor Ruth, Frank at the diner, the folks at the church. You don't have to do everything alone anymore." Then he drove away, leaving Margaret standing in front of the barn, a deed in one hand and Lucy's small hand in the other. That night, they built the biggest fire the wood stove could handle and celebrated with canned soup and crackers. Lucy danced around the barn, singing about having a real home, and Margaret let herself imagine the future for the first time in months. She could fix this place up, make it truly livable. She could plant a garden in the spring, grow their own vegetables. She could keep working at the diner, save money for Lucy's future. She could give this child the childhood she deserved, filled with safety and love and possibility. Over the following weeks, Margaret threw herself into improving their home. True to his word, Robert had the electricity turned on, and the first time Margaret flipped a light switch and saw the barn illuminate, she cried again. No more lamplight, no more darkness. They had lights. She hired a local handyman to fix the worst of the roof and help her insulate the walls. The money Robert had given her stretched further than she'd imagined possible. She bought a used space heater for the coldest nights, a hot plate so they could cook real meals, a small refrigerator from a thrift store. Frank at the diner increased her hours when he learned she had a permanent place now. "You're the best waitress I've had in years, Maggie," he said gruffly. "About time you got some good luck." Pastor Ruth and the church community rallied around them too. Someone donated a real bed frame and mattress. Someone else brought over boxes of clothes their kids had outgrown, perfect for Lucy. A retired teacher heard about Lucy and offered to tutor her twice a week for free. "This is what community means," Pastor Ruth told Margaret. "We take care of each other." Margaret had spent so long being independent, so long believing she had to handle everything alone, that accepting help felt strange at first. But gradually, she learned to let people in, to trust that not everyone would abandon her. Lucy blossomed, with regular meals and warmth and stability. She grew taller, stronger, happier. She learned to read fluently, devouring every book she could get her hands on. She made friends with some kids at the church. She laughed easily now, the haunted look gone from her eyes. One evening in early March, as Margaret was washing dishes in their new sink, Robert had arranged for a plumber to hook up the well water. Lucy came and stood beside her. "Grandma, can I ask you something?" "Of course, sweetheart. Why did my real mama leave me? Was I bad? Was it my fault?" Margaret's hands stilled in the soapy water. She dried them carefully and knelt down so she was at Lucy's eye level, ignoring the protests from her knees. "Lucy, listen to me very carefully. What your mother did had nothing to do with you. You were not bad. It was not your fault. Sometimes people are so broken inside that they can't love the way they should. That's not the child's fault, ever. Do you understand? Lucy nodded slowly. Do you think she ever thinks about me? I don't know, honey. Maybe she does. Maybe she regrets what she did. Or maybe she's still too broken to think clearly. Margaret cupped Lucy's face gently. But here's what I know for certain. You deserve better than what she gave you. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you get better. You're my granddaughter now, in every way that matters. Even though we're not really related, we're related where it counts, Margaret said, touching Lucy's chest over her heart. Right here. Lucy threw her arms around Margaret's neck. I love you, Grandma. I love you too, sweetheart. More than you'll ever know. Spring came, bringing with it warmer days and new possibilities. Margaret planted a garden like she'd imagined, with Lucy helping dig holes and plant seeds. They worked side by side in the dirt, and Margaret taught Lucy about growing things, about patience, about how something good could come from careful tending. One day in April, David's car pulled up outside the barn. Margaret's first instinct was to hide Lucy, to protect her from any threat. But then she realized she didn't need to hide anymore. This was her home, her legal home, and Lucy was her granddaughter in every way that mattered. David got out slowly, looking around at the transformed barn with obvious surprise. Margaret had painted the exterior, fixed the door, added window boxes with flowers. It looked like a home now. Mom, he said, and his voice was different than before. Smaller, ashamed. I've been trying to find you for months. Frank at the diner finally told me where you were living. What do you want, David? Margaret asked coolly. Lucy pressed against her side, and Margaret put a protective arm around the child. I want to apologize. What I did, leaving you like that, it was unforgivable. Sarah and I separated. The kids are asking about you. And I've been going to therapy. Try to understand why I treated you so badly. He took a step closer. Mom, can you ever forgive me? Margaret looked at her son, really looked at him. He'd lost weight. There were dark circles under his eyes. He looked like a man who'd stared into his own soul and hadn't liked what he saw there. Who's this? David asked, noticing Lucy for the first time. This is Lucy, my granddaughter. I didn't know you had another. Understanding dawned on David's face. Mom, is she? She's mine, Margaret said firmly. She's my family. End of discussion. David nodded slowly. I understand, and I'm glad. I'm glad you're not alone. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. I've been setting aside money. Every week since I left you. It's not nearly enough to make up for what I did, but it's a start. Please take it. Margaret thought about refusing, about throwing his guilt money back in his face. But then she thought about Lucy's future, about college funds and opportunities. She thought about Robert Morrison's words. Someday, when you have more than you need, you help someone else. She took the envelope. Thank you. Can I visit? David asked quietly. Maybe get to know Lucy? Let the kids meet her? Margaret considered. Lucy deserved to have more family, more people who cared about her. And maybe David had learned something from his mistakes. Maybe people could change. We'll see, she said finally. One step at a time. David nodded, understanding that was the best he was going to get for now. I'll call next week, if that's okay. It's okay. After he left, Lucy looked up at Margaret. Was that your real son? The one who left you? Yes. Are you going to forgive him? Margaret thought about it. I don't know yet, sweetheart. Forgiveness is complicated, but I'm willing to try for his kid's sake, if nothing else. They're innocent in all this. Kind of like me, Lucy said wisely. Exactly like you. Summer came, and their garden flourished. They had tomatoes and peppers and beans, more food than they could eat. Margaret started giving away the extra produce at the church, and people's faces would light up when they saw her coming. Lucy turned 6 in July, and they had a birthday party with kids from the church and the neighbors who'd helped them. It was small and simple, but it was filled with love and laughter. Lucy blew out her candles and made a wish, and when Margaret asked what she'd wished for, Lucy said, Nothing. I already have everything I want. On a warm evening in August, Margaret and Lucy sat outside the barn, watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk. The repairs were done, the garden was thriving, and Margaret had even managed to save a little money. They were stable. They were safe. They were home. "Grandma," Lucy said, catching a firefly gently in her cupped hands and watching it glow before letting it go. "Do you think we were meant to find each other? In the barn that night?" Margaret thought about that night, about how close they'd both come to giving up, about how finding each other had saved them both. "Yes," she said finally, "I think maybe we were. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us lead us to exactly where we're supposed to be." "I'm glad I found you in the hay," Lucy said simply. "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." They sat there together as the stars came out, one by one, lighting up the night sky. An old woman who'd been thrown away and a young child who'd been abandoned, both of them finding in each other exactly what they needed: a family, a home, a reason to keep going. The barn that had once been a place of desperation had become a place of hope. The hay that had nearly been their grave had instead been their salvation. And the love that had grown between them proved that family wasn't about blood or obligation. It was about choice, about showing up, about staying when it would be easier to leave. Margaret had been abandoned by her son and found refuge in an old wooden barn. What she found in the hay changed her life. It gave her a purpose, a future, and a granddaughter worth living for. And Lucy, abandoned by her mother in that same barn, found something even more precious: a grandmother who would never, ever leave her behind. They were broken people who'd made each other whole. And in the end, that was the greatest miracle of all. Thank you for following Margaret and Lucy's incredible journey. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more emotional and inspiring stories like this one. Hit the subscribe button, turn on notifications, and share this story with someone who needs hope today. Remember, family is found in the most unexpected places.